our investigators is made on a preponderance of the evidence. So we don't need, beyond a reasonable doubt. We just need a preponderance of the evidence, or as we look at it, 51%. So, with substantiation, our investigator finds that they believe the abuse, neglect, or exploitation took place. They recommend that the perpetrator be substantiated. Their supervisor agrees, and the report is submitted as a recommendation of substantiation. That perpetrator receives notice that we found that they abused, neglected, or exploited a vulnerable adult. That individual then has the right to appeal that decision. Unfortunately, the individual is not placed on the adult abuse registry until the appeals period has been exhausted, or until their appeals have been finalized and a final determination and finding has been made. The appeals process, when they first receive the letter that we would like to substantiate them, they have 15 days to request a appeal with our commissioner. If our commissioner upholds our recommendation of substantiation, the perpetrator then has 30 days from that time to appeal to the Human Services Board. If the Human Services Board upholds our finding, the individual can then appeal that decision all the way to the Vermont Supreme Court. Unfortunately, that means that it can be upwards of a year until the appeal is finalized, meaning, as we discussed, that individual could continue working with vulnerable populations, could work in a different facility during that time, and until their name is placed on the registry. One of the loopholes, or one of the cracks, unfortunately, is that if that perpetrator bounces from place to place and we can't keep track of where they're working, even though they're placed on the registry, if that agency, that organization doesn't do annual or regular background checks, that individual may continue to work with vulnerable populations. If, however, we are able to keep track of where that individual is working, once their name is placed on the registry, and these phone calls are fun, we can tell that agency that they've been placed on the registry and they should do another background check. So again, when the investigator recommends substantiation, if after the appeals process is completed, the substantiation determination is upheld, they are added to the adult abuse registry. I have not seen this happen yet, but I hope to soon. The perpetrator can be fined up to $10,000 for abuse, neglect, or exploitation of a vulnerable adult. And the commissioner shall notify, has the right to notify, and will notify the Office of Professional Regulation or any other professional licensing board applicable to the violator. However, Office of Professional Regulation, medical practice boards, Medicaid fraud, law enforcement, all of those agencies have much larger windows and time frames for their investigations. Our investigators at this point are tasked with completing their investigation in a maximum of 90 days. That is a really quick turnaround. Wow. The majority of the other professional investigative agencies have a minimum of a year to complete their investigations. So if we're doing an investigation and we know that our perpetrator has a professional license, we're going to get that professional licensing board and their investigator involved as quickly as possible in hopes that their investigation will move along faster. We've been talking about how long it can take to get someone on the registry and keep them from working with vulnerable populations. Medical Practice Board, Office of Professional Regulation, they have the ability to suspend licenses or to revoke licenses and prevent that individual from harming another vulnerable adult in a much faster, cleaner process. Any questions? We've covered a lot of information.
I have a question.
Sure.
What is there out there for the caregiver? Because the facility I've been talking about has bullying amongst caregivers. If you turn, say you turn somebody in, then that caregiver gets bullied by all the other caregivers. What is there out there to protect the caregiver from the other, from the facility, the person running the facility, and the caregivers? Is there anything out there for the caregiver?
I am not
Because I know the
completely
place I'm
familiar-
talking about has had a lot of bullying amongst the caregivers on other caregivers.
The Division of Licensing and Protection, the survey and search side, I am sure that within their regulations would be some protection for appropriate and professional behavior
Okay.
amongst caregivers and amongst employee and supervisor.
Okay.
But again, I'm not
Right.
100% familiar with all of their regulations.
Right.
But that is definitely where I would head them first
Okay.
for
I was
support.
curious about that, if there was anything out there for them.
Yes.
Okay.
In actuality, there's very little,
I know.
very little. It's, in other states, it's not quite as bad as Vermont, but there's a definite, you're guilty until proven innocent in the state of Vermont, as
yeah.
opposed to you're innocent until proven guilty in many other licensing areas.
Yeah.
I've been a traveler my entire nursing career, and I've worked under many states' licensing boards.
And you've probably seen that.
And Vermont is by far the most adversarial in the United States in terms of assumption of guilt on the part of
Right.
professional
Right.
license holders.
Yeah.
That's really, it's just the way
The way it is.
it's
Well,
done.
in discussing abuse, neglect, and exploitation of a vulnerable adult, from where I sit, I would argue that the perpetrator actually has much more protections than the victim does. So I think maybe from the medical practice or licensing boards that's the case, but from an investigative standpoint and from our statute, the victim doesn't have the right to appeal over and over and over again. The perpetrator has 3 different appeals.
And you
and
said right up to the Supreme Court, you
Right.
said.
Yeah.
So I would say that they are innocent until proven guilty 3 times.
Yeah.
My point was that you have very little recourse within the licensing board. I mean, because this is your livelihood, and if your license is revoked, there's not, I mean, there goes all of your resources in terms of.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that, I think it's good that victims are protected. But I was addressing a specific question. Is there anything in
About the
place to
caregiver, for the
protect the
caregivers.
caregiver?
Yeah.
And in point of fact, there's very little
Yeah.
in the state of Vermont. Really, just needs to be fairness in both directions. There needs to be adequate investigation. It looks like there's quite a bit of investigation set up within Adult Protective Services. You've listed quite a bit.
Yeah.
Often there isn't, I mean, your only resource is court suing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And if you're in that situation, you should threaten to use it vigorously from the instant that something, I mean, if you feel like somebody says you've done something, you're abusing a patient, and you're not, you should.
Well, you definitely should
hit
fight
them.
it. Absolutely.
Well, but what I mean is, you can't assume that somebody is going to give you the benefit of the doubt.
Right.
You can't assume that your director of nursing or the board of nursing is going to approach this with the idea that you might not have done it, that it might have been a mistake or an error or a jealousy or anger, some other reason.
But a lot of times I think it's just brushed under the carpet.
And it's also important, to note that if you're working in a facility and there's an allegation made, there are regulations regarding what the facility has to do
Right.
to protect that resident. So even if, and believe me, we've seen this, even if the facility knows that this allegation is false, they still may, depending on the regulation, depending on their licensure, they may have to suspend that that individual, that caregiver, until their internal investigation is completed.
Until they know for sure.
Right. So they have. I don't. I don't think that it's always saying you're guilty. It could be they have to show that they are protecting the residents and that they are following their regulation, even if they know that it's a false allegation.
Yeah, because the main goal is the elderly person. That's the way it should be.
Right.
What if they're on a dementia unit where the allegation has been made and they say, well, we asked the resident and the resident said that didn't happen, but you have to move out this unit, and that person that apparently did the
Gets to stay there.
abuse gets to stay there.
Yeah.
How would that work? And then according to that person, they got a letter in the mail saying that it was a lapse in judgment from the state of Vermont.
Those are difficult situations.
There's a lot of loopholes.
There
Mhm.
there are
I've never
potential
dealt
for
with
loopholes, but also there are regulations and there's statute, and sometimes the two don't mesh well.
Because I think it was like 3 or 6 months later, they fired him for abuse after the fact.
Yeah, but in the meantime,
But
he
it
got
was
to
a
abuse.
different set of abuse charges.
Yeah, but in the
on a
meantime,
different
he got
resident.
to continue doing what he was doing to the poor people.
Exactly.
That's the sad thing.
Yep.
It is.
Yep. I mean, I had been there for like a year, and they had just come in and just started, and this happened. And she's like, "Oh, well, you have to move units," and I ended up getting written up. And it's just like, I couldn't believe it. It was crazy.
You were trying to do your job properly, and you're the one that got.
Yeah, they also
In
told me
trouble.
that I had 24 hours to report. Both me and the nurse went and reported it at the same time, and it was within that 24 hours. But they never got it to, I'm suspecting it's APS, be within that 24 hours. So then they said, well, you didn't report it within 24 hours, so now you're written up.
Yeah.
So the facilities also have very strict reporting guidelines, and they have to report a number of things even beyond abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And I do know that there are a number of facilities that have been fined and have received deficiencies for not reporting in a timely manner. So I know that that's on the licensing of the survey and certification side, that they have not only the mandated reporting, but they also have regulations around reporting.
Well, I know we had called her earlier, and she's like, well, I don't want to hear it. I'll
So
talk
you
to
went
you
through
in
the
the
same
morning.
thing I did, pretty much.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's sad.
They
So
never
again, I
suspended
would-
that person or anything.
No, they didn't on my end either.
I would urge that I think it gets very tricky and it gets very dangerous for the individual when agencies have in place that a supervisor is the only one that can make reports. I would urge you, again, that if your agency has that policy, that you sit with the individual and make that report, or that you make the report and let your supervisor know, I made this report, here's a copy of what I reported. If you need to report it as well, please do so. But in some way to protect yourself, because again, you are the mandated reporter. You are also, even if your supervisor is the one that, even if they do make the report, we're going to ask, we want to speak to the person who witnessed the incident. We want to speak to the person who the disclosure was made to. We don't want to get
Right.
second, third-hand information. So we're still going to end up asking to speak to the individual.
And you can't say, oh, I told my director of nursing.
Right.
I reported it. You can't, you have to know that it kept going.
Well, when you go to your supervisor, the person that you're supposed to go to report these things, you assume that they're
Of course.
taking the proper
Yeah.
procedures.
But if they don't, it's
But
your fault.
in the facility I worked in, you're not allowed to just sit there. I had to go back to work. You're not allowed to just sit there and well, I'm gonna sit here while you do what you gotta do. We weren't allowed to do that.
Yeah.
So I
So
would
we
just,
need to follow up, right?
again, and I think that's why you have the 48 hours.
Right.
You know, so again, you can use the web intake, it's available 24 hours. You can, you know, when you do have a chance, submit it. You can call, although again, because we can't release information regarding reports that came to us, you know, you could call and say, you know, I want to make sure that a report was made on this incident. Although we can't tell you if it was or it wasn't,
Right.
you're going to know, because if there wasn't a report made, we're going to continue asking you questions.
Exactly.
We're going to try and get that
Right.
information.
Right.
If the report was made, we may ask something like, do you have additional information regarding this that you would like to add? So, you know, you're going to
So we just gotta
know.
remember those key questions that you ask.
Right.
Well, again, we're not able to tell you if a report has been made, but
Right.
through the conversation, you're
You're
going
gonna
to
know.
You're
We're,
gonna
we're gonna know yes or no.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
See, where it's, the rule was, you reported it to the nurse or, you know, and then they did their own
Yeah,
investigation.
your supervisor.
And
the person
then
over you.
lots of times, well, we got all the facts and it wasn't, you know, what it was made out.
So-
But that, I mean, it's all switched
That
hands
does
now,
get-
but that was what the rule
Right.
was, and then they would do their own investigation and then.
And I
could
know
go-
that it gets very tricky in facilities
So.
because licensed facilities are required to do their own internal
Right.
investigation from the survey and certification side.
Right.
We would prefer on the APS side that they don't do that internal investigation until we've done ours. Because that allows, we have a facility right now that it allowed they allowed the two individuals involved to continue working together. They had 3 days before a report was ever made to us to work together, to build their story,
Yeah.
to make sure that they were on the same page. Unfortunately, they weren't very good at that. Well, fortunately for us and
Right.
for the victim's family. But it would be better on the APS end if the internal investigation portion of regulations didn't kick in until after the report was made.
I agree. Totally.
Any other questions, scenarios that you wanted to run by me? Concerns? All right, well, we do have this lovely little quiz that Alan put together.
Yeah.
Again, I think you will find all of the information available to you, and hopefully we touched on all of it.
Are we graded?
Oh, and also because I turned the person in and we're at this facility, I can no longer work there at all. I can't go in the doors. I'm not allowed in the
That's-
place.
Well, maybe
Yeah,
that's a
I-
positive.
Yeah, it is.
All right, let's find out how to turn this off.
Little button that you push.
Yeah, there was a
Stop
little.
button right there.